Germany are out of the 2022 World Cup, and the reason that they are out is because they did this prior to their game against Japan. Not because they have clearly been on a downward spiral since winning the World Cup in 2014, not because they don't have any right-backs and didn't start a recognised centre-forward, and certainly not because they couldn't cope with Japan's pressing, particularly in midfield, and failed to put 7 goals past Costa Rica like Spain. No. It is all because of this. A 5-second protest that the German players chose to make in response to FIFA banning them and several other national teams from wearing the OneLove armbands. And that is all there is to it. Or, at least, that is what plenty of Qatari officials and journalists, their paid stooges, and useful idiots would have you believe. On television, in print, and on social media, this is the narrative that is being spun. It is almost unfathomably stupid and illogical, but that hasn't stopped a flat earth movement, ironically, from spreading around the globe, or millions of Americans from believing that a cabal of satanic cannibals are operating a global child sex trafficking ring which conspired against former US President Donald Trump during his term in office. So, clearly, sometimes a little bit of pushback is required. We will start at the beginning, which is always a good place to start, I find, with the reason why the German players staged a minor protest ahead of their opening fixture, since that seems to have been a bit obscured in all of this, and both willfully and accidentally misinterpreted. Germany's hands over mouths protest wasn't actually a protest about Qatar, LGBT rights, or anything directly to do with the host themselves. It was meant to signify the fact that FIFA had sought to silence the German players and several other teams by banning them from wearing the OneLove armbands. This was, if anything then, purely and simply, a protest about the suppression of protests and freedom of speech. There also seems to be some confusion about what even the OneLove armband represented, the thing that Germany were protesting about not being allowed to wear by FIFA. The OneLove armband was not designed for the 2022 World Cup or directed at Qatar for their anti-LGBT laws. It has been worn by various team captains for at least the last 2 years, at both club and international level, including at Euro 2020, and it is meant to signify diversity and inclusion. That's it. Within the heart on the armband, though, there are the colours of the rainbow or pride flag, which is associated with LGBT pride and solidarity movements, which carries the obvious implication that, I know, this is going to shock some of you, but within the banner of diversity and inclusion is the inclusion of LGBT people. That is seemingly where the problems arose, since homosexuality is illegal in Qatar, punishable by up to 3 years in prison and a fine, and technically the death penalty for Muslims. Nonetheless, Qatar insisted as part of their winning bid in 2010 that, in accordance with FIFA's inclusion policy, they would not restrict the display of pro-LGBT imagery, such as rainbow flags, at the 2022 World Cup. A promise that they reiterated in December 2020. As with allowing the sale of alcohol within the stadiums though, this was a promise that Qatar wouldn't keep, only officially reneging on it at the last minute, by which stage FIFA could do little about it. To prevent the 7 teams who had expressed a desire to wear the OneLove armbands at the World Cup from doing so, FIFA implemented their own campaign in partnership with 3 United Nations agencies, designing no fewer than 5 different captains' armbands that team captains would be able to wear at the World Cup, with slogans which included #NoDiscrimination, #SaveThePlanet, #ProtectChildren, #EducationForAll, and #BeActive. In doing so, FIFA rather undermined their own demands for others to keep politics out of the World Cup. Save the planet seems like a perfectly good idea to me, but is anyone seriously going to pretend that various governments' climate policies are not political? Least of all, at a World Cup in a host country which depends exclusively on the export of oil and gas. Education for all might seem like a pretty incontrovertibly good idea, at least to most of you watching this video, but it can hardly be decoupled from politics. There are at least 8 countries where fewer than a third of girls receive even a primary education, either due to discrimination, a lack of funding, or both, all of which are explicitly political decisions. In Afghanistan, girls are banned from secondary education by the Taliban, who regained control of Afghanistan and reintroduced the policy 18 months ago. One of the most common arguments made by FIFA and Qatar has always been that people must respect Qatar's laws and culture, even when those laws and culture criminalise their very existence. Well, by that logic, what right does FIFA have to be making political statements about education for all? Surely, they ought to be respecting Afghanistan's laws and culture. I suppose respect, in the eyes of football's governing body, is to be bought, not earned. And since Afghanistan is impoverished rather than being very rich like Qatar, there is really no need to respect the barbarism and cruelty of their rulers. Protect children is an odd one, since it is vague enough to be both meaningless and insulting when promoted by FIFA at the same time. Protect which children exactly? Presumably not LGBT children. There is very little protection for them in Qatar. In fact, they are criminalised by the state and routinely subject to police brutality, at least according to the investigations made by human rights organisations. And what about the children of the thousands of migrant workers who lost their lives working in Qatar since the country won the right to host the World Cup in 2010? Did they not deserve protecting? Presumably not. I guess all children are equal, but some children are more equal than others. No discrimination is particularly stupid and egregious, given the context in which these slogans were created, seen as though it is essentially promoting the same message as the OneLove armbands, that is to say, diversity and inclusion, but without the LGBT aspect. If FIFA wanted to be honest, that armband would actually read, "No discrimination." Unless you're gay, in which case, yes, discrimination, lots of it please, and enjoy your 3 years in the gulag. Admittedly, that would have to be written in a much smaller font, but that's a sacrifice that I would be willing to make in the name of honesty. #BeActive is probably the only one that is so banal, vapid and pointless that it isn't as blatantly hypocritical as the others. On that front, FIFA practice what they preach, since they are undeniably active. Actively idiotic, insulting, corrupt, and deranged, don't get me wrong, but active nonetheless. So that is the context behind Germany's team photo protest. They, like several other national teams, were irritated by FIFA threatening Sporting, rather than purely financial sanctions, for wearing a non-approved armband. But unlike those other national teams, the players themselves actually decided to do something about it. There is an argument to be had that they, and indeed the other teams that had planned on wearing the OneLove armbands, ought to have just taken a yellow card, which would have been a more powerful statement and would have created a really powerful image that most likely would have endured throughout the decades. Or, even better, if they had any kind of nous about them, they would have just banded together and told FIFA that if a single one of their captains is shown a yellow card, they'll all walk off the pitch. If they had done that, FIFA and Infantino would have buckled like the spineless clowns that they really are, just as they did when it came to suspending Russia from FIFA and UEFA, a decision that FIFA and UEFA only took when other European teams declared that they would refuse to take the field against them, or indeed any Russian teams, backing FIFA into a corner. Anyway, all of that is besides the point, since that isn't what happened, and I'm just talking about what actually did happen, which was the hands over the mouths, we're being silenced team photograph, which apparently was such a massive distraction for Germany that and that alone caused them to be eliminated from the group stage of this World Cup. If you're wondering how the decision to stage that protest came about, I would imagine that it went down something like this. Someone within the Germany squad, I would wager that it was Manuel Neuer, given that He is their captain and has been their most vocal advocate of human rights, and their most outspoken player on LGBT issues, though obviously I cannot be sure, will have said something like this: "Lads, since FIFA are being so draconian about the armband and the DFB have backed down, I was thinking that we could put our hands over our mouths to illustrate that we're being silenced. It ain't much, but it's better than doing nothing." And the rest of the Germany players went, "Yeah, alright, that sounds like a decent idea, Manuel. We'll do that then." Admittedly, that conversation most likely happened in German, but I am ashamed to say that I only studied German for 6 months at school, and I wanted you all to be able to understand what I was saying. Either way, I suspect that was the extent of the deliberations within the German squad, whatever language it was conducted in. Almost certainly German. Why would it be anything else? From start to finish, you're looking at a maximum of maybe 10 minutes, and even that's a stretch, probably whilst they were hanging around by the pool at their hotel in Qatar, or sat down enjoying a meal. I suspect Hansi Flick didn't interrupt a training session and say, "Alright lads, bring it in. You know that game against Japan tomorrow? Yeah? Well, forget about that. We were going to work on our defensive shape today and maybe rehearse 1 or 2 free kick routines, but I've decided to knock that on the head. Instead, we'll spend the day devising the most effective protest possible to illustrate our irritation at FIFA banning the OneLove armbands. Who's with me? Yeah! Oh, and, you know those tapes that I told you to watch tonight, Yoja and Leon? About how Morita and Endo press in the Japanese midfield? Yeah. Well, forget about that as well. I don't want you to do that anymore. If you could just go and watch Brokeback Mountain tonight and this compilation that we've put together of the 101 greatest sporting protests, that would be great instead. Now, look, I, like you, have absolutely no way of knowing. I don't have hidden cameras inside of Germany's team hotel or at their training camp. Just these images that Getty provides, so that might be exactly what actually happened. But somehow I doubt it. I very much doubt that Niklas Zula, Nico Schlotterbeck and Thomas Muller went to bed in Qatar the night before their game against Japan thinking about the protest that they were going to do before kickoff, playing out all of the different scenarios in their minds and debating whether Neuer had suggested doing it with their left or right hands. These are guys who've won the Bundesliga title and Champions Leagues. Heck, some of them have even won the World Cup. I suspect that they are quite good at focusing on football, but hey, what do I know? The most viral tweet claiming Germany had lost because of a lack of focus on football was by this guy, with the username @Qatari, who is apparently a sports journalist from Qatar. He tweeted, "This is what happens when you don't focus on football," with a photograph of the German players covering their mouths before the start of their game against Japan on the day of that defeat. I responded to Mr. Qatar with a simple question. If Germany lost because they didn't focus on football, given that Qatar had, at that time, and even more so now, been the worst team at this World Cup, what were they focusing on? Unfortunately, despite my quote tweet being viewed by over 1 million people, if Mr. Qatar was one of them, he didn't feel inclined to respond. Plenty of other people did respond though, almost 500 of them in fact, and the general theme of those responses was an obvious one. Alfie, you cannot compare Germany and Qatar. Unlike Germany, Qatar have always been rubbish at football. When you ask those people whether that's just because they've always not been focused on football, you get a whole raft of excuses for their performances and group stage exit. Qatar has a tiny population, physically their players were outrun and outfought, they weren't tactically astute enough, the size of the occasion and the pressure got to them, and so on and so forth. Of course, all of them, or at least some of them, are perfectly true. Qatar are the reigning Asian champions, it is worth pointing out. Meanwhile, Australia, Japan and South Korea all progressed, who aren't Asian champions, but by and large, they are all reasonable points. But what the people pointing out those very obvious facts that everyone knows seemingly fail to realise is that in their defence of Qatar going out in the group stage and being rubbish, for lots of different but perfectly legitimate reasons, they have themselves acknowledged that there are lots of reasons why a football team can lose games of football and get knocked out of a World Cup, and none of those reasons are because they did a 5-second protest in the pre-match team photograph. Amusingly, Japan, which is a relatively LGBT-friendly country, at least within the grand scheme of things, and where the vast majority of people have no problem with homosexuality, wore the exact same Adidas training tops with rainbow-coloured stripes as Germany in the warm-up to that game. I know what you're thinking. That cannot be! However would they have been able to maintain focus? The mind boggles. They must be superhuman. Similarly, the England players have staged a protest of their own at this World Cup, taking the knee as they did at the Euros, and yet, somehow, despite what must be an enormous distraction for them, they somehow managed to batter Iran 6-2 and win their group fairly comfortably. Again, the English, it would seem, are superhumans, somehow able to combine the vicious mental strain of performing a very minor gesture before a football match and still win. Just imagine if we actually focused on the football. We probably would have put 17 goals past Iran and would have won all 3 group games. I also keep seeing it repeated that Denmark and Germany were the only 2 countries whose politicians wore the OneLove armbands in the stands, and that their group stage exits are somehow karma for not sufficiently discriminating against gay people or something. I know that's not true because UK politicians did likewise, even conservative ones for Christ's sake, since Labour MPs agreed to boycott the tournament, and Sports Minister Stuart Andrew is himself a gay man, and yet, again, by sheer force of sporting genius, Herculean mind power, or the English being immune to karma, Gareth Southgate's men still found a way to progress. To be fair, maybe the English are immune from karma. I have had neither the time nor the interest to check how many other countries' politicians made some kind of pro-LGBT gesture in the stands at this World Cup, but I don't need any others to help me make my point. The ones from the silly island from which I hail will perfectly suffice. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that Germany went out in the group stage of the 2018 World Cup as well, arguably with a stronger squad and starting 11 than this time around. Was that also because they weren't focusing on football? And if so, what exactly were they focusing on then? Or perhaps they had just anticipated the creation of the OneLove armband, FIFA's draconian measures prohibiting it, and had been planning their extravagant hand-over-mouth protest for the last 4.5 years. Again, it seems improbable to me, but I suppose there's no way of ruling it out. I would also note that Germany actually did better at this World Cup than the last one, where they won just 1 game and finished bottom of their group. Of course, all that mattered is that they went out, but it is quite amusing that Spain, who were much more fancy than Germany pre-tournament and are being heralded as one of the group stage's best sides, had the exact same set of results as Germany, just different scorelines, which saw them progress ahead of the Germans by virtue only of goal difference. Both Spain and Germany beat Costa Rica, lost to Japan, and drew with one another. I must have missed Spain's protest before their game against Japan, but boy oh boy, were they focused against Costa Rica. After Germany's group stage exit was confirmed, on goal difference, our old friend Mr. Qatar took to Twitter once again, of course he did, dropping another absolute banger of a tweet. A banger in terms of it doing numbers, that is. I regret to inform you that the content was utter tripe once again. Whapping out his favourite photograph once again, which he ironically has probably done more to popularise on social media than any other single user, Qatari captioned the image, "Don't leave your flags behind." Lord give me the confidence of a country that spent over $200 billion hosting the World Cup, built the world's most expensive football academy, and scouted over 3.5 million boys from 17 different countries, only to lose 3 out of 3 group games and become the worst host nation in the history of the FIFA World Cup. and still have the confidence to rag on 8-time finalists and 4-time winners. Qatar were one of only 2 teams, along with Canada, not to win a single point at this World Cup. They were unequivocally the worst team at the tournament, and their keeper looked like he'd only played football for the first time about a week before the World Cup began. In fact, given Germany's astonishing record of success in world football's most popular sport, compared to Qatar's total and abject failure, having only ever qualified as hosts and then proceeding to lose every single game, it is probably worth asking ourselves whether, rather than it being a distraction, not taking an undue interest in other people's sex lives is actually a considerable advantage. Perhaps if Qatar were just a teeny weeny bit more gay, or, at least a little bit less obsessed with persecuting gay people, they'd have enjoyed just a fraction of Germany's success. And yes, you are quite right to think, come on now Alfie, that is stupid and nonsensical, but it is really no more stupid or nonsensical than seriously believing that Germany, or anyone else for that matter, went out in the group stage of this World Cup because they wanted to show the tiniest bit of solidarity with the LGBT community and staged just about the most minor and basic protest imaginable. As well as our old friends' tweets, one of Qatar's leading sports programs mocked Germany's group stage exit by ending their show waving and covering their mouths, just as the German players had done before that game against Japan. Or, at least, that is how it is being reported and what people assume is going on there. But given that Qatar got slapped silly at their own World Cup, after investing billions, scouting millions, and trying to naturalise players from across the globe to play for them, losing all 3 group games whilst Germany only lost 1, surely they wouldn't be that stupid. No, I'm not having it. There is no way that they're that daft. What I reckon is actually going on here, that everyone else is overlooking, is a copycat protest from several prominent Qatari broadcasters on live television. After all, Qatar ranks among the worst countries on earth when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. In November 2012, Qatari poet Mohammed Al-Abjami was handed a life sentence in prison, believed to be solely because he criticised Qatar's government during the 2012 United Nations Climate Change Conference. Al-Abjami wasn't even present at his own sentencing. He was released in March 2016 by a presidential pardon, following a great deal of backlash within the international community. Again, no justification or reasoning was given for either his sentence or his early release. In September 2014, Qatar passed new laws as part of a broader crackdown on free speech throughout the region in light of the Arab Spring, and fears among autocrats and dictators that their own citizens could demand greater democracy or freedom. The laws, notably vague in their wording, essentially granted Qatari authorities with a legal justification for clamping down on any speech or expression that they didn't like, with sentences of up to 3 years behind bars and fines of up to 50,000 Qatari riyals, which is just over £11,000. Content that may harm the country is what was officially outlawed, but the law states that the authorities can judge in any case, regardless of what is actually said, whether it is harmful or not, and no guidance was offered as to what might land you a hefty fine and prison sentence. So, perhaps we might just have witnessed a historic, covert, and brave protest inspired by Germany's footballers live on primetime Qatari television. Or maybe they really are just tone-deaf idiots. Again, there's really no way of knowing. In many respects, this whole Germany discourse is no different to those who tried to claim that Marcus Rashford's form went off the boil because of his activism, rather than because he played almost every game of football for an entire season whilst injured, which I also made a video about. It was nonsense then, and it is nonsense now. Rashford's best form actually coincided with some of his most intense and prominent activism and forcing of government U-turns around the issue of free school meals. But, I guess that didn't fit the narrative. In both instances, it is people who don't support the causes in question, whether that be LGBT rights or the state helping to provide for impoverished children, but who often aren't brave enough to come out and actually say that they oppose those things, who make weaselly little digs at people with far more talent and moral integrity than them, and try to blame anything that goes wrong in their lives or against them on their activism, and on that alone. Even if it were true that Germany lost because they did a tiny pre-match protest, or that Rashford's goals dropped off because he secured free school meals for a load of kids in England, what would you rather? To take a principled stance, or to enjoy sporting success? If Muhammad Ali had lost to George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle, would that invalidate his principled stance against the war in Vietnam? Would he suddenly, therefore, have been better off carpet bombing kids in Southeast Asia? If it meant that they got out of the group stage, would it have been worthwhile for Germany to buckle at the cowardly bullies of FIFA's feet and to have done nothing instead? If it meant that he won the Premier League Golden Boot, but he would have to quite literally take food out of starving kids' mouths who are growing up in much the same circumstances that he was raised in, would that be a justified or worthwhile trade-off for Marcus Rashford? In reality, what Rashford has actually done off the pitch, and had done at the age of about 23, outweighed anything that he could ever do on it. Rashford could win the Golden Boot at this World Cup, and he really could at the time of this recording, he's scored quite a lot of goals, and then the next one, and inspire England to win the World Cup at both, and it still wouldn't outweigh what he has done to help some of the most vulnerable people in the United Kingdom, who so rarely have anyone speak or stand up for them within public life, because hardly anyone in British public life has any understanding of what their lives are like, or any solidarity with them. So sure, laugh at the Germans. They deserve it. They have been far too successful for far too long when it comes to this football lark, whilst the rest of us have had to witness failure upon failure. It is about time that they tasted a bit of heartbreak themselves and knew how the rest of us felt for a while, until, they inevitably start winning everything again. But don't misrepresent the reason why they lost to Japan and ultimately went out, because much like believing that the earth is flat or that satanic anti-Trump cannibals rule the world, it makes you look like an idiot. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Of course, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on either Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so. Cheers.